Welcome back, everybody, to the latest Thatcher Report podcast. If you're new, I write an essay and Substack, Thatcher Report, zacharythatcher.substack.com, called the Thatcher Report. And then I like to record a little bit more of an expansive podcast about it. So I appreciate your patience. Bear with me. I'm a I'm an amateur, like all of us at life. Okay, this latest one is called Beyond Blue Walls, and I published it yesterday. So on the eve of the Gregorian New Year, so I'll call it. So Beyond Blue Walls, this is something I've been thinking a lot about since Thanksgiving when I had some family conversations, and I not singling out my family or anything, but this is just what's happening now. So like a lot of the politically homeless or the newly independent or whatever you want to call this kind of emerging non-aligned way of thinking of former Democrats, I had some pretty frank conversations, like I mentioned, over Thanksgiving, which rolled into Hanukkah and Christmas. I was in San Diego, I was in Newton and Boston, and also checked in with old friends. And I'm really, really lucky. I have a gigantic family for me, for a secular person, or more or less secular family. It's an unusually large family, and there's just a lot of humans. My dad has 17 offspring, children and grandchildren. That's kind of awesome. Um, and I interacted with a lot of them, a lot of other people, a lot of other people who are close to me. They're essentially family. And there are sometimes moments of tension. That's okay. It's a normal part of life. But I've really shifted my worldview, my political worldview, something I think a lot about, from what I'll call the mandatory liberal consensus to the iconoclastic critical thinking, which I think being an iconoclastic critical thinker is absolutely necessary if you agree with classic liberalism. But, whatever, that's kind of highfalutin. The point is that there's been some friction because I'm just kind of not in the liberal camp anymore. So I had to, it wasn't nothing bad happened, nothing too crazy. We all love each other, but I definitely learned, perhaps the hard way, that some topics are kind of off limits, while other ones about kids and food and things like that are more like safe harbors. And I'm the one to blame for this. This is all me doing this. And what I mean by that is that, like, look, I don't know what to call myself now. I'm still a registered Democrat. I've not really voted Republican in my life, and we just had a mayoral election in New York City. It was essentially two Democrats running against each other, a centrist establishment Democrat, Andrew Cuomo, versus the younger progressive vanguard, Zohran Mamdani. So I chose Cuomo. It's not really, it was sort of a strange election, maybe we'll see more of them. But in any event, I don't know what I am. Am I post-liberal? Am I non-liberal? I don't know. But I know that I can. We'll get the essay will wrap this way too, but I can't ever go back to the kind of modern liberal leftist way that I once navigated the world for my entire adulthood, where I would, here's what it looks like. And also keep in mind, I'm Gen X, so I've lived through a couple of media upheavals in our lifetime and communication technology changes. But, here's what the contemporary liberal leftist way of the world looks like from my perspective. You read the establishment press, and you cluck at the maliciousness and ignorance of Republicans while hoping that some kind of minority person ideally will run for office. They're going to hopefully come from the Ivy League plus schools, and obviously they're only going to be a Democrat. You don't pay attention to anything outside of the Democratic Party. This person, if they're successful in being elected, he or she will pass large spending bills. They will raise taxes and increase fees to fix some problems for a few specific groups that are categorized as marginal. So in my lifetime, we went from talking about minorities to marginal people, but it means the same thing. And they'll fix things according to them for these marginal people with new agencies, new laws, new bureaucracies, new structures, new regulations. And the playbook is you got to build government, promote certain people over others, and increase revenue to pay for all of it. So since Republicans are bad, or they're ignorant, or they're racist, all of the above, it's you don't consider another view. There's not like soul searching about the right kind of policies, or if this is even the right framework to think about the role of government or how you actually advance your goals. No, you just this is the playbook. You essentially develop government targeted at very specific groups you want to promote. Other groups get demoted by default, and you got to pay for it. So it's forbidden to question this framework. And one thing that I love asking, even though it's forbidden, is have the decades of this kind of liberal legislation empirically assisted the groups that they've defined as marginal, or what were once called minorities? Uh, Obviously things have gotten a lot more expensive. Empirically, we can just see like buying a car, getting healthcare, going to college, paying your municipal property taxes. That's all going, and I'm talking blue states, that only goes up. Those prices have gone up a lot, way more than inflation in many cases. But what about better? You know, the big picture is that after the civil rights movement, you can kind of date that to the mid 1960s with the passage of the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts. The liberal democratic consensus has been to keep going. We're going to do a great society, Lyndon B. Johnson. We're going to do affirmative action, which turned into DEI. We're going to have LGBTQIA plus rights and as the focus of our policy. How's it going for those groups? You're not allowed to ask that question. That's not the point. You would be unjust even to ask if that's good, or if that's been effective. All right, but more to the point, is this how a democracy is supposed to function? Right? You only have one choice of a political party. There are two, but you can only choose one. And within that party, obviously parties are really big. It's a big country. You only have two sub choices. You can choose the establishment, or you can choose the vanguard. And let's say you don't like the establishment or the vanguard. Well, that's too bad. But there's nothing else to consider. Anyone who disagrees with the establishment or the vanguard, they're wrong. You're right about everything. So this is the framework. I sound reductive, I sound simplistic, but this is the framework as I've experienced it over, I don't know, 30, 40 years. And the question is this a good way to be a person? Personhood is really a key concept in classic liberalism. We extended, we're not subjects to a king, we're citizens, we're individually citizens. We get individual citizens have agency by voting. This is how it works in the Western world in classic liberalism. The individual is really important. I like adding a moral dimension to my thinking. So, how about being a good person? And I think in the framework of what I'm talking about, being a good person means being a good citizen. Good citizens vote for good governance, right? It's measurable. You're voting for something. You're trying to have good governance. And if this nation is successful, how do you measure it? It's because it's liberal in the sense that it enables the freedom and vitality of its citizens. This is a really good idea. I love it. Happy 250th anniversary, America. This idea went viral, as they say, and took over the Western world. And it's just fantastic. So if you're enthusiastic about classic liberalism, Western Enlightenment values, how can you discount half of the voting citizens when they vote in ways you don't like? If you say, oh, they're just in a cult, well, that means you're anointing yourself in a way that doesn't comport with democracy. You're saying you're better than all these wrong cult people. So another way to think about this, and I see these stickers constantly, I hear this all the time in my neighborhood and in public conversations, all those people crying fascism is perhaps actually fascistic behavior in and of itself. I could spend a long time breaking that down, but I think you get it. If you're always saying, oh, you're fascist because you disagree with me, well, that's kind of impinging somebody's ability to disagree. Disagreement is vital in a democracy because individuals are valuable. This is how this works. It shouldn't be complicated, but I think contemporary modern liberalism and left wing kind of sensibilities have just frankly gone off the rails into some really dark places. All right. Why am I talking about this? Well, because a few years ago, I never asked any of these questions. Life was just really good as a Democrat. Now, I was certainly well read, I thought, because I relied on the establishment press primarily, or pretty much only. And I knew there were some differences within the cohort, right? AOC, Bernie Sanders, because of their focus on, I guess, kind of non Western ideas about liberation and social justice and diversity, I knew that they were wrong when it came to the Middle East. And the history, their contemporary history of the Middle East is that there's a violent march of Islam from Arabia to the rest of the world. That's what's happening. It's been happening for a really long time, for hundreds and hundreds of years, but it kind of got turbocharged. It went down because of the failures of the Ottoman Empire. The Western Christians won World War I, and Ottoman Empire went away. But now it's back in a new form with 20th century Islamism is the kind of term, Islamist, which is the kind of new contemporary way of talking about essentially Muslim sovereignty as a specifically Muslim political framing, right? And it's pretty extreme and violent. A lot of people in the Middle East don't agree with it, who are Muslim, but nevertheless, this is the historical, the people making history are these Islamists, and they are trying to expand their worldview via tactics of violence. And you can talk about 9/11 in America when we were attacked by Al Qaeda. That's what motivated is this Islamist worldview motivated those attacks. You can then look at ISIS, the IRGC in Iran, Boko Haram and Al Shabaab in Africa, Hamas, the Houthis, Muslim Brotherhood, Hezbollah, on and on and on, all these groups that are unfortunately world famous. And that's kind of what's happening. The progressives don't seem to understand that that's what's happening. And that's why there's horrible terrorism in Mali, in Paris, in Israel, in New York, all over the Middle East, of course, Central Asia. No, that's sort of ignored anti-Israel activism. It's kind of what's happening for progressives. That's their focus. And I was okay just kind of ignoring that. I just thought that they didn't quite get it. And but the majority of the Democratic Party did. They were kind of sane, rational thinkers. They believed in Western values, right? They weren't kind of turning a blind eye to irredentist violent Islamism. They were sort of like, okay, we just kind of support democracies, right? And progressives are just kind of these silly idealists, and they've made this weird mistake where they think that brownish Islamists, I guess they're kind of brown looking from the West, from the American color obsession, that they kind of thought they were victimized Black people, like in the civil rights movement in Alabama or something. And it's an honest but kind of weird mistake for the progressives. But outside of that, that was kind of small and not that important. Outside of that, there was a really coherent trifecta: the Democratic Party, mainstream media, and academia. And this kind of trifecta not only understood the world very well, it was really the only way to live. They understood reality and they conditioned reality in a way that made sense. So, for example, this kind of right thinking person, correct thinking person, they read the New York Times if they're a newspaper reader. And if they're intellectual, they like the New Yorker and the Atlantic. And if they're not a big reader, that's fine. There's NBC, CBS, ABC, NPR, then later MSNBC, CNN. That's it. Those are your choices. About a little bit of a bunch of acronyms that you can watch on TV or listen on one of them you can listen on the radio, and maybe a few sources to read. And that's your information base. And then, speaking of information, the goal is to go to a highly selective college. That's your life goal as a young person. I looked it up. I did a bunch of research. There are about 50 what you would consider highly selective colleges in America, colleges and universities. Maybe you could argue maybe up to 70, maybe down to 30, but let's just call it 50. And, at 10,000 people per institution, you get about 500,000 students, 500,000 students right now, today, are in these highly selective colleges. Well, I also looked up how many college age adults are there in America. That number is around 30 million, right? So that means less than 2% of the country go to these highly selective colleges of the typical age for a college student. Now, this winnowing of humans through the selective college gauntlet has an impact. It creates an educated aristocracy, right? It's like Downton Abbey. Their dad owns the land, his dad owned the land, you therefore own the land. And that makes you an aristocrat, obedient to the king. Well, we have our own kind of version of that, but you can just go to, if you're of the 2%, you get to join. And these people, not all of them, obviously some of them become Republicans, but the vast majority will form an allegiance to the media news sources I just detailed that told them those schools are selective in the first place. Like who decides what's selective? Okay, well, you get the U.S. News and World Report and all the articles in the New York Times constantly about Harvard, and you get the picture. You obviously made the right choice. And your education, meanwhile, has instructed you to only vote for the Democratic Party. There's not a choice. This Democratic Party uses the mainstream media as its communication channel, right? You don't subscribe to the Democratic Times, you read the New York Times, and it's the same thing. It only promotes the view of one political party. And it's not, I don't mean to only pick on the New York Times. This is true for most mainstream media sources. And wouldn't you know, the people who go to these selective schools form up the reporters and producers and editors and even the owners and publishers of these news sources. And what a funny coincidence. The people who go to these highly selective colleges then become the faculty members and administrators of every educational institution. That's K through 12 in the public school system, obviously, and in the private schools, and then all the way through graduate school. So this is a really tidy and self-reinforcing system. And what you get out of it is that you've graduated. If you're lucky enough to go to one of these highly selective schools, you've become the person living the only sensible way to live. There are no other options. You do get dark blue or light blue, and have a great life. Go for it. So we're told often by these people that in a democracy, we're encouraged to share differing ideas. Free speech is number one in the Bill of Rights, freedom of religion, a couple of other wonderful aspects in the First Amendment. But this is really a great idea. But, quietly, sotto voce, there are no other options. This is it. There's only one. Now, it seems, kind of nuts, but I've only lived and I continue to pop around between New York, California, and Massachusetts. That sums up my whole tiny little life. And I encounter this stuff all the time on a daily basis. And it's essentially a religious orthodoxy. I've started life as a secular Jew, also with a non-Jewish parent, and I got a good, healthy dose of kind of white Protestant values, I guess, or whatever you want to call that, as well. So a bit of a blend. I'll always be that blend, but I've become much more Jewishly observant, Jewishly knowledgeable in my life, and I'm in an Orthodox world now, more or less. And boy, this contemporary liberal worldview sure functions like a religious orthodoxy. And the chosen people know the truth. Self-chosen, but they know the truth. And anyone who disagrees, you can either convert them or subjugate them, which is honestly in their best interest, because wrong people shouldn't have power. They'll only hurt themselves. We're just, we know what's best for everybody else. So I know that sounds really extreme and really reductive, but now that I've left the fold, I'm often criticized for heresy. This is a pretty common topic. Now, I think more and more people are like me. I don't think I'm in the majority at all. The Democratic Party has a very large, powerful base, which is reinvigorated by the progressive movement. But anecdotally, I'm finding more and more people, not just Jewish people, who are kind of saying, right, this is kind of like an orthodoxy, and I don't really feel a part of it. Now, there's a lot of evidence. You can just sort of poke a hole in this orthodoxy really easily. You can just look at some really big problems coming from this framework. You can look at the COVID response that took kids and teenagers out of the school system for 2 years. And I've anecdotally talked to parents of children and how some of these kids have really struggled. Now, I don't know a lot of very low income people, but I can only imagine what it's like for people to have had their kids at homes. What's happened in New York City is a lot of those people just didn't go back to the school system. They're just out. Therefore, they're working or they're on some kind of form of welfare support. Maybe they're doing something illegal. I have no idea. They're surviving in different ways. But the point is that the COVID response was really bad for white upper middle class people, which I tend to know more of, and I think incalculably worse for everybody else. There's zero introspection about that in the Democratic Party. There's nobody litigating with the COVID response. Then obviously there's the transgender response, which still continues. It's obviously much, much smaller. It's much more niche. I think it harms mentally ill children and teens. I'm noticing that almost no other Western country does the same kind of medicalization and thinking, the sort of really bizarre pathologizing of young children that we do, of children and teens that we do in this country when it comes to gender. But again, there's not a lot of introspection about that. And then big picture, so there's COVID, I think is kind of a problem. The trans thing, I think is kind of a problem, but it's kind of small. And then just look at, liberal legislation causing income inequality, prohibiting housing starts. There's very little new infrastructure. We have not supported in-country manufacturing for decades, and we certainly don't have affordable healthcare. I think it's easy to look back and say that these are all these really big problems. But you know what? I'm talking facts. That doesn't matter when you're talking about a religious belief. It's a completely different way of thinking. Evidence is based on rational thinking. Religion is spiritual. Now, not one is not better than the other. I'm a religious person. You need feelings, you need thoughts, you need your spirit, you need all these things to navigate the world. Nothing is better. But I think you get where I'm going with this. When we're talking about politics, it's good to be kind of rational. And I've questioned the faith, and now I'm out the church. I don't use church terminology very often for myself, but you're not allowed to question the faith. You have to leave. So why isn't everybody leaving, right? It's so obvious income inequality is a problem. It's so obvious that California and LA, which had all these horrible fires, you're not reading stories about, oh, there's a new forest of skyscrapers popping up all over LA to respond to the terrible fires and create tons of new housing. So it's actually kind of cheap to live in LA, and more people should move there. No, that's not happening. Almost no new housing is being built, and more people leave California than come to California. I happen to love California. I think it's a really special place. It's too bad that it's become prohibitively expensive. So why aren't more people agreeing with me? Well, I think this whole party, press, pedagogy trifecta, that's a little bit easier to read than to hear on a podcast. But the Democratic Party, the mainstream media, academia, they work really well as a kind of pseudo-religious identity because it's very resistant to critique. You're not allowed to critique it. That puts you on the outside, and you don't want to be on the outside. You're going to get insulted. You're going to get yelled at. It's just bad. You just are kind of castigated. I deal with this very, very frequently. So if you disagree with the liberal consensus, you're wrong. I just had this conversation the other day. I'm not going to, make it personal or anything, but I had a conversation with somebody that I know to be very educated, very generous from this particular liberal framework. And they just, very smart person, presumably well-read, all these things. And this person said that the people who disagree with them are just wrong. They're just wrong. Now, why would you listen if you're rational? Why would you listen to wrong people? There's nothing to learn from them. There's nothing to absorb. It's just us or them. This, in my lifetime, and for all of our experiences, I think this has become even more intense since the rise of Donald Trump and Make America Great Again, MAGA. MAGA sounds kind of scary. Make America Great Again sounds kind of great. I don't really understand the again part, but it's just gotten worse. The polarization has gotten worse. I don't think the polarization comes from one side. I don't think you can only blame Donald Trump, who's obviously a very purposely divisive figure. I think it also comes from the left. Now, in the essay, I have a digression about how come there's not a democratic version of MAGA. You can just say MAGA and you can just understand it. You can practically hold it in your hand. I'm in the marketing world. This is called branding. This is brand identity. It's almost tangible. Coke, you know what it is. Nike, Lululemon, I don't know, you can the NBA, you can just practically it's almost like it's a physical object that you can hold and look at and comprehend, and you can say, oh, I want that or I don't want that. Republicans have this. They have this for a long time. The Democratic Party just doesn't function that way, right? It's a looser, less defined coalition, and I think there are three kind of main blocks within this coalition, right? And obviously, there's gender and geography and income levels and stuff and those kind of things. But I think that as far as I understand it, the Democrats have kind of three main groupings. There's the establishment centrists, right? This is Chuck Schumer. It used to be Andrew Cuomo. I think it's Gavin Newsom. There's the younger social media progressives, right? Obviously, Zohar Mamdani, AOC, Bernie Sanders, not social media, not young, but he is the leader of this cohort. And then there's a lot of little smaller blobs that they call the groups. These are very, very well-funded ethnic, gender, environmental, labor, sex, SECTS, not sex, not SEX, SECTS. These are little sects, but they're really powerful, and you get it. It's like a religion, right? Now, it's not like all Catholics agree on one thing. There's other sects within Catholicism. They have various constituencies in the Vatican and out in the world, and they all kind of play off each other, and then kind of create what we think of as the Catholic Church. So, big picture, the Democrats are a big tent. They can't really have this top-down policy branding of the GOP, and so, as far as I can tell, they use two levers, two tactics to retain power and to get votes. They use slogans and they use intimidation. And this has worked very, very well up until 2024. I think it's going to work really well in 2026 with the midterms. 2028, it's too early to tell from my perspective. But I don't think the Democratic Party is going to change that much. I don't know. It's stupid to predict the future. But slogans and intimidation are the two functions that I've noticed in the Democratic Party and sort of the wider liberal way of navigating the world. So let's talk about the slogans. Now, these slogans come from two places. They're poll driven. So there's all these professional people. I know one of them, he's a super smart guy, absolutely savvy player. And David Axelrod and all these, very famous people, and they're absolutely smart folks who get paid to win elections. So you can sure bet they win elections. They have pollsters, right? There are some really famous pollsters. And then that's one way you can learn what slogans are going to work. And the other one are these sects, SECTS. I have to come up with a better word for this. These little, small, but really powerful groups within the Democratic Party. And they're powerful because they're extremely well funded, right? It's not like the environmental groups or the labor groups don't have money behind them, or some of these different gender or the various ethnic kind of constituencies. They're empowered. They also drive some of the polls, some of the slogans. So here's the latest one, right? These come and go. But the latest one is now affordability. Okay, it's kind of funny. Democratic policies in blue states made life wildly expensive, but okay, now they're talking about affordability. Yesterday, it was diversity and the supposed climate emergency. Those are kind of the slogans from before. I know it's a little bit more complicated than that, but these are some of the slogans that I think we can all remember. Now, tomorrow, it'll be a new type of slogan. I don't think affordability is going to last very long. We'll have to hear what the polls and the groups have to say. Now, slogans are kind of intellectually thin, and like diversity, like what does that even mean? The climate emergency, not an emergency. Affordability, well, how are you going to make things more affordable? It's great to talk about it. I think affordability is the number one issue, but do you have any track record of delivering on that? So they're intellectually thin, and they don't last very long. So, for example, hope and change from the Obama years. It's not quite enough. You also need a boogeyman. You need intimidation. You need a common enemy. So when I grew up, the Democratic kind of liberal consensus was that big business was the enemy, like the Koch brothers, these really obviously bad actors. Those are the enemies. Now today it's MAGA, which is about half the country, a little bit more than half the country. So yesterday, and still kind of today, there's a libel that Republicans are all racists, and then they're the aphobes. They're transophobes, Islamophobes, homophobes. That was sort of yesterday. It still kind of continues, but that was the thing. Like they're big business and they're racist, or the homophobes, or whatever. Now the libel is that Republicans are racist fascists or anti-Semitic fascists. No kings, right? We don't know monarchy, no kings. Democracy is in danger. We're the only people who can save democracy, and democracy is in danger. So I know that I'm doing like a digression within a digression here, but I promise I'm going to come back to the main point. Now, as of the past couple of weeks, Democrats and their allies are hopping up and down that Republicans are anti-Semites. And it's just, but all Democrats, basically, the Democratic consensus is that they just hate that, the whole world is great, the UN is a great institution, but there's this one tiny country on the planet that needs to go. Weird coincidence, it happens to be Jewish. So there's the classic anti-Semitism on the far right, which is very easy to observe because these podcasters have a big mouthpiece, but yet an entire political party wants Israel to go. Okay. So if you have a couple of months to read up on anti-Jewish pathology from the medieval era and before, maybe you can tease apart some nuances, but I don't have a lot of time here. So I'm just going to say that the far right podcasters, Tucker Carlson, Candace Owens, a few others, they are kind of in this classic anti-Semitism mode. It's sort of racial thinking. Nick Fuentes, Jews are just inherently bad just because they're where they're born. Some of these podcasters are smarter than that, so they kind of disguise their thinking with America First excuses. And it's really, it's very recognizable. It's really odious. It's bad. Well, on the other hand, you have the entire Democratic Party, from local municipalities passing laws against Israel and the boycott, divest, sanction movement. You have almost every single university. You have the entire mainstream press. And now most of Congress wants to eradicate one little country on the planet that happens to be Jewish. So you tell me which has a bigger impact. So going back to the slogans, the last Democratic slogan from not even just a few weeks ago or a month or two ago was no kings. Well, wouldn't you know it? We have a lame duck Republican president right now. Every day that passes, he gets less and less power. It's only going to get worse for him, from his perspective, into the midterms. That kind of makes the no kings talk seem not very compelling, right? He's clearly not a king. Don't worry about it, the Democrats say. This is not a problem. We'll just develop a new scary framework for our political opponents. Personally, I can't wait for the talk of monsters and goblins, zombies maybe, I don't know. But it's just very, very mutable, right? So we have these very changeable slogans. We have this intimidation factor. And from my perspective, I think this is kind of hilarious. It creates these very funny paradoxes. So I think for about 11 more months until the midterms, we are going to hear almost every Democrat rallying around the term affordability. To me, as somebody who's only lived in blue states, which are the least affordable states in the country, I think that's just kind of hilarious that they think they can run on affordability when they have a track record of making things wildly unaffordable. And I don't think they have any compelling ideas to actually make things affordable. Mamdani is an easy target to mock, and I don't really think mocking people is a great way to expand your thinking, but making buses free and expanding various social services that he says will double New York City's budget from 100 billion to 200 billion. It's a lot of money. Where does that come from? You just tax other people, not us, somebody else. I don't think that's going to work very well. And meanwhile, affordability is the slogan, and then anybody who disagrees with this party, this thinking, is a fascist because they didn't vote for the Democrats. So I think if you rely on polls and powerful sects, powerful little groups for slogans, while castigating anyone who disagrees with you. I don't think that's very attractive to independents. Now, there's obviously only two political choices, so it's up to Republicans, right? I think the ball is usually in the court of the Republicans. I think that they have a better track record. They've certainly won the executive more frequently in this country. It's not a mystery to me. The Supreme Court, Congress are sort of barely majority Republican. I think the country is majority center right, not by a lot, but I just think that's sort of the general vibe of this whole country, if you can sum up 330 million people. So it's up to Republicans to have a good counter to these slogans and intimidation. They don't always do that. So independents will go the way independents want to go. They're not stupid. They're going to choose the outcome that makes sense to them. But I don't think it's a good idea. If I was in control of the party, I don't think that this is what I would do. Essentially, it's, quote, let's just see what sticks. That's it. That's the whole policy framework. And I don't think that's good. I think it's anemic. But if you have the mainstream media, the cultural institutions, and the entire academic world in your pocket, the show lumbers on. It's imperfect, but it works well enough. There's only two choices, so there you go. So let's talk a little bit about how maybe liberals frame this for themselves, right? You often hear talk of the blue bubble and flyover states. And liberals aren't. None of the people I'm describing in anything I talk about are dumb, right? And I'm like the one smart guy. Nope, not at all. I think I have a reasonably good perspective, but many other people have reasonably good perspectives, and we're all kind of jostling together to try to find our way forward. But liberals themselves acknowledge, in a kind of a jokey, lighthearted way, that they're in a blue bubble. Now that I'm not in that bubble, when I look at it, I think it's more like a fortress. It's a really big fortress. You never have to leave it. Of course, I just mentioned the flyover states. The fact that most of America lives outside of this fortress doesn't cause any introspection around liberals. They just say, hey, look, Minnesota. It's not all bad in the flyover states, right? And it's a very narrow, cloistered, willfully cloistered way to live. This to me is very devastating thought. And it makes me kind of emotional, kind of sad. In the civil rights movement, the Democratic Party, now they had to be brought there kicking and screaming, and it's a complicated thing. The Democrats were the party of segregation and racism, and it changed dramatically in the 20th century. Big picture we make up the future, we make up the past in the future. So looking backwards, the Democrats championed the civil rights movement. And the idea is really simple: enfranchise all Americans for the vote. We didn't really have a democracy until the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. We just had millions and millions and millions of people, Black people, weren't allowed to participate in this democracy. Some important legislation was passed due to the heroic work of so many civil rights activists. And now we do have a bigger democracy. It's great. So the Democrats championed enfranchising all Americans to vote. Wonderful. The problem is that later on, they decided this vote is conditional. You can only vote for one group. This sums up my entire problem with contemporary liberalism. It's not really liberal. Real liberals, meaning classic Enlightenment era liberals, say, you get to vote, you have agency. I'm not going to tell you what to do. I'm just a person. You're just a person. I don't want you to tell me what to do. You could decide for yourself what you want to do, and you vote that way. And I will decide what I want to do, and I will vote the way I want to vote. That's a respectful way to live, I think. I think it's a moral, it's a humble way to live. That's not what's happening in the left wing. They say, oh, okay, essentially, Black people, we think you should have the vote. I think the consensus in this country is that was a really good thing. On the right and on the left, everybody agrees that was a lot of hard work and a lot of sacrifice, a lot of blood in the streets. A lot of people were assassinated. It was horrible, but we got there. Black people should have the vote, guaranteed. But you can only vote for one of us. And that's like taking away the vote. It's not as bad as taking away the vote, but it's conditional. It's not a good way to think. So that sounds crazy, right? What am I talking about? Who would ever say that? Well, just look to the 2024 election where Trump in New York Trump increased his share massively in New York City, more than any time in recent history for a Republican. A third of the Bronx voted for Trump. No, the Bronx is the most Black, most minority, marginalized, I don't know, I don't like using that term, is the most minority borough and the poorest borough in New York City out of the five. A third of them of these voters chose Trump. Okay, the Democratic way of framing that was that, first of all, these people are quote unquote low information. That's what we're told. The assumption is that these people were deluded. And unfortunately, Kamala Harris, although she checked 3 of the marginalized identity boxes, which is super important to genetically focused Democrats, just so happens, total coincidence, she was a lousy candidate. So these deluded people were also seeing, even though this candidate was Black, she was just not good at it. And they chose Trump. A third of them chose Trump, which is just it's obviously a minority of a group, but that's a really big number for Black voters. And I've almost never heard from this kind of, anecdotal, Democratic, liberal kind of group that these lower income Black voters were capable of selecting their own least worst outcome, which is, by the way, how every single person faces a democratic election. In every country, that's a democracy. That's a true democracy. You don't choose the most optimal candidate often that you want. You choose the least worst candidate. And that's just, the Winston Churchill quote. That's just, it's a terrible form of government, but every other form is far worse. I don't really hear that coming from mainstream Democrats, that these Black voters were being rational decision makers. No, I hear that they were suckers for a sexy con man in a year with just happens to be a less shiny Democratic product. Now, obviously, I'm repeating myself. I have a problem with that viewpoint. I don't think it's respectful. I don't think has any type of humility to it. But look, if you're standing on the fortress walls, everyone outside is either a threat or they're kind of dumb. And remember what I said before, liberalism means you're right, everyone else is wrong. There's no exceptions. I don't think there's much of a chance for democracy either, but hey, who's counting? So outside the fortress walls, we get it, right? They're a threat, they're going to destroy everything, or they're just kind of dumb and they're gullible, or they're just kind of low information, or whatever condescending term you want to use. Now let's look within the fortress walls. Let's take a look inside those walls. It can be a very rewarding system. There's only a hitch. There's a hitch though. There's only 2 castes that can do well, 2 groups of people. You can either be very wealthy or you can be aristocratically educated. Now these groups overlap, they're mutually reinforcing, but they're kind of distinct in a way. Those are the 2 ways to succeed in the liberal democratic fortress: vast wealth or an aristocratic education. Now, as an aside, hopefully you won't be white, straight, or male. Now, unfortunately, if you are, that's okay. You just have to be mindful of your privilege. How are you mindful of privilege? Well, we can't define it. We can't score it. We can't quantify it in any way. But you just have to use your vibes. You have to create your own racist and self-congratulatory interior monologues about your unfortunate superiority and just do your best. Okay, that's the racial element. And, or just feel really bad about the genetics that your parents, in a fit of passion, thoughtfully passed on to you. Thoughtlessly, passed on to you. All right, so let's go back to the cast. Really, the racial stuff is kind of a sideshow, if you really think about it. The big picture is wealth and education. Let's think about how they reinforce each other in the myth making. For example, one of my favorite examples, Barack Obama, one of the most successful presidents in my lifetime from a political point of view. He won 2 terms, always popular vote. He had Congress in his pocket for a while. We were kind of told that it was just remarkable that he joined the aristocratic educated class because he went to Harvard. Harvard Law Review, first Black president of Harvard Law Review, remarkable. All right, well, let's just take a nanosecond to look at Barack Obama's history. He went to an elite prep school in Honolulu called Punahou. Like his children, and most likely his children's children, and their children, they'll never, ever set foot in a public school. Barack Obama joined the aristocracy the educated aristocracy because his very hardworking grandmother became a VP at a bank in Honolulu. Now, she didn't start as a VP at a bank. She had to claw her way at the top. She had to make lots of sacrifices. His grandfather had to make sacrifices. They were essentially raised him. They were like his parents. And guess what? All parents who love their children have to make sacrifices. This is not unique to the to his grandparents, but they did a really good job. There's hats off. He obviously is a very gifted, intelligent person, and they gave him the best of an elite private education. My point is that Obama is not a rags to riches story. Far from it. Liberals, the liberal culture that he came to dominate for a while, no longer, I don't think. He's sort of more of like a retired saint at this point. But liberals are since the civil rights movement, maybe this is an inherent problem with the Democrats from their segregation days, I don't know, but they're very focused on skin color. So they created a Hollywood narrative for him. This man, he triumphed despite all the evil forces against him. It's absolutely remarkable that he made it to be president of Harvard Law Review. Well, the true story is that he was a prep school kid who went to a highly selective university, like all prep school kids. This unremarkable fact got him a book contract when he was 28 years old, and this book, which is absolutely fabulous book. I actually recommend it. He's a really smart guy. He's a wonderful, wonderful writer. Dreams of My Fathers is truly great memoir. I say this as all sincerity. I really loved it. This propelled his political career. This remarkable story of a prep school kid going to a private university, an elite university. Now, what did he do with this political career? I think that's a little bit up for debate. As far as I can tell, sitting now in 2025, with hindsight, looking backwards, Obama used his power to make America less affordable while he and his cohort lined their pockets. I think that's the big takeaway. So do you remember all those jails full of bankers after 2008, or how he balanced a budget and ended all those dumb wars? Neither do I. The story of triumphing despite adversity is true for all adults, all of them, every single adult. Doesn't matter if you're rich, doesn't matter if you're poor, it doesn't matter what some people think about your melanin content or your genitals. The details always vary, but no one enjoys a life without devastating roadblocks they must overcome in heroic acts of self-transformation. That's the story of life. That's all of our lives. Now let's go back to this life within the fortress and the caste system of education and wealth. Now, Zohran Mamdani, he's treated very similarly to Obama in many ways. I read this constantly in the New York Times and some of the adjacent blogs and things. Is Mamdani a charming and noble survivor of Islamophobia who rose tonight, this very night, he will rise to the pinnacle of New York City politics despite all the racist headwinds against him? Is that the story? Or is the story that he is a member of both the wealthy elite and the aristocratic educated classes who continues to gain power for himself and his allies? Does anybody really feel bad for Zohran Mamdani? He comes from a very wealthy and well-connected family. He is obviously a smart guy. He went mostly to private schools or for a few years to one public school, Bronx Science, which is essentially functions like a private prep school. And then he went right back into private schools. Is it a big mystery that he's powerful and will continue to gain power? Now, the one thing I like to think about with all this kind of fortress talk is that Trump is exactly like this too. He also comes from vast wealth, and he also came from the Ivy Leagues. But the mainstream media disfavors his genetics and his gender and his sexuality and his religion, right? He's a white, straight Christian male. This is like the worst outcome possible, according to the Democratic liberal framework. And he's had an absolutely remarkable life story. I mean, it's just amazing to think about his multiple transformations into one of the most powerful people, into the most powerful person on the planet again after losing his life. I mean, it's just a crazy story. You wouldn't believe it if it was a Hollywood movie. But this crazy topsy-turvy story is never told really in a laudable way in the press. So, we get the heroism of Mamdani and Obama, but never Trump. Now, hilariously, I think this explains why Mamdani and Trump are friends. I think it's a lot of people were scratching their heads about Mamdani's visit to the Oval Office, and it's amazing. You just can't make up how funny and how similar these two men are. And if you look at the caste system, it makes a lot of sense. Now, I should talk about myself, right? Uh, I'm not like some working class outsider looking in on this. I am a proud member of one of the two castes. I don't come from any money, really. Middle class life, sort of. Now you'd even say maybe lower middle class, middle class. I don't know. But I am a member of the aristocracy, the educated aristocracy, because I did well enough in the public school system, K through college, including college, to finally go to one of these highly selective private schools. Phew, barely made it. So now, congratulations, Zachary. I'm now a member. I'm now an obscure member of the educated elite. Great, good job, right? Pat myself on the back. It took a lot of work and a bunch of lucky breaks to get there, but I did it. And I don't have any debt because I had scholarships and I paid back most of my college. Okay, great, good job. I'm so proud of myself. Okay, so why am I biting the hand that fed me, right? What am I doing? This is crazy. I've done very well, right? I'm reasonably close to kind of the upper tiers in the economy. Not really. Wealthy people are far, far, far above me. I eat what I kill. I live paycheck to paycheck, but they're decent paychecks. And I'm certainly way higher up than the non-selectively educated masses, right? By and large, I'm doing pretty well compared to maybe a blue collar person. I don't know. We'll see how long that lasts. I don't have any stability, but so far it's been a pretty good life. The problem, why I'm biting the hand, is that I was shoved out the portcullis, or however you pronounce that word for the castle gates. I was kicked out of the gates. So, yeah, you guessed it. This entire podcast and the essay that spawned it is just me complaining. It's just sour grapes. Now, I can wave my own fancy diploma as much as I like. I can talk about beach vacations in Martha's Vineyard and Malibu and drop all the right names of all the right locations. I can talk about my passion for urban composting. I can talk about and to all my gay friends as much as I like. None of that matters. I am no longer allowed in the fortress. Okay, so what did I do so wrong? I must have done something terrible, right, to get me kicked out. And then I'm only making it worse by recording this podcast and being using the critical thinking tools I learned in college and applying them, which is not allowed to the own frameworks from whence I come. What did I do wrong? Okay, so starting in maybe the 2000s with the rise of the Barack Obama phenomena, the Liberal Party started to focus on genes and gender rankings. And I kind of started to drift away from that. And here's the short version. I ranked low on this ranking list. And that's really hard for me to take as a member of the academic aristocracy. I like to do really well on tests. I like to try to become an A student. I want to get a good score on the APs. And then when I'm told that my genes and gender just happen to be on the short of the totem pole, that was hard to stomach. And then, unfortunately, by 2024, just for being alive, I violated the Fortress HOA rules, and they had to kick me out. All right, what'd I do? Okay, you know the punchline here. I'm Jewish, and I'm Jewish in a way the Fortress doesn't accept their Jews. Some Jews are allowed. The incoming Mamdani administration will have a handful of Jews. Bernie Sanders is ethnically Jewish. He doesn't seem to identify with the Jewish people. We're a peoplehood, but whatever. He's got the genes, and that doesn't count against him. But I'm Jewish in the wrong way because I'm in favor of Jewish sovereignty in the indigenous Jewish homeland. Now, here's what I'm asking. I don't think it's a big ask, but here's what I'm asking. And this ask kicks me out of the party and out of the whole framework. And I think there's other reasons, and other people have their other ways of getting kicked out, but this is specific to me. I'm just sharing. Thank you for listening. I want about 10 million people in a land mass about the size of New Jersey to be free of attack in Israel, in the indigenous homeland of the Jews. That's my ask. 10 million people, a rough landmass of New Jersey size, so not a very big area, and I just don't want them to be attacked. That's my big ask. And therefore, since they are attacked, I want them to be defended. And part of that defense, I think, comes from arms sales from America and political support. But in any event, I want this little New Jersey-sized place to be free of attack. Now, what's the broader context? The planet has over 7 billion people. Some countries, like the country I'm in right now, they're nearly the size of continents. Okay, I don't want any of that. I'm not asking for a billion people. I'm not asking for something that's the size of half of North America. No. Give me New Jersey, slightly different location, but yeah, okay, with some of the same people. Okay. Zionism, this is called Zionism. It seems really trifling and frankly completely irrelevant to daily American life. And it should be. It shouldn't have any impact whatever, really, on anything having to do with daily life in America, just outside of some foreign policy stuff, which is a small part of the action. For example, I don't see many people in America getting worked up about similarly sized countries like Iceland or Slovenia. These countries don't dominate the press and the discourse, and they don't try to lump people into groups of you do count, you don't count, you can't count, you're wrong, you're right. But I don't make the fortress rules. They've chosen Israel and Zionism, the belief that there should be in Israel, as a huge, huge issue. I think Slovenia got a lot of strong feelings about it. No, I'm just kidding. Slovenia seems great. Let's ignore it. I think it's safe to ignore most of the time Slovenia and Iceland, and my life is going to be just fine without thinking about them. I don't think people should think about Israel very much. If you're not Jewish, or if you aren't traveling, planning a trip there, or going to an Israeli restaurant or something, I don't think you should think about Israel basically ever. You should think about other things, like in America, like your family, like working, like what movie you want to watch tonight. So yeah, there's a bit more nuance to why I was kicked out of the fortress. It's not only about Israel. Like I said, these shifting gender and skin color rankings on this frankly bizarre two-dimensional privilege scale. Imagine like a line, a horizontal line, and there's like a little bar in the middle, a little toggle. You can move it back and forth on the privilege scale. It's not measurable. I have no idea what is on the axis, but that's the thinking. And then there's also this frankly anti-Western liberation narratives. That's like the land acknowledgement stuff, which is literally anti-Western, anti-colonial. That's my favorite thing. Like, I don't know, if you're in America and you have an American passport, aren't you pro-colonialism? This is why we're here. This is how we got here. This is how the country got built. But no, you have to be sort of anti-Western. You have to have a liberation narrative. You have to be anti-colonial, which therefore, let's be positive. We're going to back freedom movements. We're going to back liberation movements. We're going to back resistant movements without ever thinking about the pesky consequences of moral behavior. So remember the Arab Spring? Was that a flowering of democracy? Did that work great to support those movements, or are things even worse for your typical Arab in your typical Arab country? What about Islamic terrorism? Is that resistance in Tel Aviv, but a crime in Paris? Okay, who decides where the Islamic resistance is okay? 9/11 in New York City, that's bad, right? But 10/23 in Israel, that's okay. That's resistance. I don't understand. So you get it. I'm Jewish in a way the fortress no longer approves, right? And there's other reasons, but being Jewish is a big part of it. And so that's the straw that broke the camel's back for me. For you, it's going to be something else. And I'm curious what that is. But for me, that's what it was. And I'm going to go a little bit more, and then I'm going to write. What would you do? Have a little empathy for me if in a moment, if you don't mind me asking you of this. What would you do if a growing and popular movement, the progressives, few of which have ever been to the Middle East or are familiar with the history of 20th century Islamic nationalism or for that matter, 20th century Jewish military history, which I can sum up. We had one big loss followed by a couple of really spectacular wins. What if this growing and popular movement dedicated themselves to the destruction of the one tiny New Jersey you happen to find special? How would you feel? Now, I always love thinking about other groups, not just my own. And I come from a mixed ethnic background, economic classes, education classes, all these different castes. I happen to come from a bunch of different castes all together. It's pretty amazing. I'm very lucky. Thanks, mom and dad. Thanks to my step-parents. Imagine if a political movement that's lavished with attention by the mainstream press and anointed by the country's very best universities as the only way to think. Imagine if they all decided that Italy was a pariah state, and sorry to say, Italy has to go. No more Italy. End the pasta colonial hegemony, carbs or genocide, free the Etruscans. I think it's fair to say that Italian Americans would immediately seek different politics, find different media outlets, and start to wonder if the schools they've told are so essential to their lives are in fact naked little emperors wearing invisible little mortarboards. Would you blame them? So look, I'm not you. You'll have different reasons to exit the fortress. I just want you to think about it. Maybe you have a white son and you don't like ranking him at the bottom of this imaginary privilege slider or totem pole, to use a non-PC term, if you think about it. Maybe you don't like ranking him at the bottom. Or maybe you have a Black daughter and want her to have more political choices, or just a political choice when she's in the ballot box when she's older, and an even playing field of a meritocracy. So, for me, it was a decade or so of creeping doubts about promoting some people over others, but it took me a while to understand the inherent problems with affirmative action and DEI. I was pretty late to recognizing that the problem there. But, looking back, I feel justified questioning all of that. Now add to that rising income inequality and just how incredibly expensive it is to live in California, Massachusetts, and New York. Housing, education, healthcare, transportation, you name it. Then look backwards in the rearview mirror, not too far back, to the Democratic governance response to COVID. I think it victimized children and teens for 2 years, wealthy ones, poor ones, even worse. And that all kind of started to make me question a little bit, in hindsight, if Democrats and the media and the cultural and academic handlers had been kind of pointing us in the wrong direction. The COVID response seemed kind of crazy if you're looking at a framework of children and teenagers. Now, thankfully, the kids were all right in COVID. It was the adults who made the mistakes. Then 10/7/2023 happened, right? That's like the October 7th Hamas attack in late, a little over 2 years ago. The next day, the mainstream liberals had to debate. Who's the good guy and who's the bad guy? Well, they resolved in this conflict. Well, they resolved that debate using the very familiar skin color and privilege lines they've relied on since the early 2000s, right? This is why we have mainstream Democratic senators and congresspeople trying to pass legislation to limit arms sales to Israel, but not to Saudi Arabia or Pakistan. Now, this legislation obviously fails with Republican majorities, but that's like where the mainstream Democratic Party is now. Richie Torres, John Fetterman, Josh Shapiro, these people are far on the outside. This is not the mainstream party anymore. After the Hamas attacks, the Democratic Party, the media, the academy, I think their minds were already made up, but they sort of had to sort through the Hollywood narrative. Who's the superhero? Who's the supervillain? They chose Israel as the supervillain. They chose the Palestinians as the superheroes. And, didn't matter what I thought anymore at this point. There's no more real policy conversations. I was picked up by both arms and tossed out the liberal door. Once outside, I had a first opportunity to take a look and see where I had been. It was a large but crumbling fortress. I don't envy life inside its walls. It's the view outside that excites me. All right. Thank you so much for listening. I know this is a long one. Appreciate your patience. Look forward to hearing your comments and thoughts. Take care and Happy New Year.